All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Black Diplomats Podcast. And this week, we're going to be talking about Black folks' views on foreign policy. And the best person to talk about that is Christopher Schell. He's a fellow at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And basically what he does is he focuses on Black folks' opinions about U.S. foreign policy. He's pretty much the only person that does it. And so anytime I talk about Black people in foreign policy, I'm always citing his work to contextualize everything. And so you are the man in that regard. You're the one we got, and so that's why you're here.
Thank you, Terrell. Thanks for having me back again. That's a huge honor, to know it's a heavy task, heavy lift, but also an honor to know that I'm one of the few, if only, person that's really talking about this. But I think just real quickly to even just add on to that, there's a ton of scholarship on Black folks and foreign policy, but I think I'm kind of like an interlocutor where I'm taking it from like the ivory tower and I'm kind of like translating it for, these spaces that we're in where there's not many of us. So I think I'm kind of like a, only one talking about it, but kind of like a translator of sorts.
Yeah, that's Chris being modest, but but he's right about that. There are people who are doing the work on it, but I think as far as like the surveys that are accessible to us as journalists, the ones that we can use, and you're right, making it digestible for us to do it, then you're the one that's kind of doing these live time surveys, right? What are Black people thinking about right now? You're the guy that's doing it, and we just need more people like you that's also doing it. By the way, anytime I see another HBCU person on, we gotta shout it out. I'm from Philander. We don't have like the cool shout out like y'all do at Howard.
Oh yeah, the HU.
Even though I am not from Howard, I just gotta say it. You know what I'm saying?
What's your shout out? What's your school shout out?
We don't have. Philander Smith College. It's in Little Rock, Arkansas. We don't have one.
Hey, here we go. It's on you to create one. You created Black Diplomats. It's time for you to create a shout out.
That's not my thing, dog. My shout out would be so corny. I need to do something like, we need like a cool. Mine would be the Drake response to Kendrick Lamar.
Ooh.
It'd be good, but somebody could do it better. You know what I mean? Like, we need somebody that like do something dope. All y'all Howard people like, y'all shit whack. You know what I'm saying? And like, come back guys, like, like Black school culture, like you got to have like your own thing that's like really, really good that stands on its own. And I think that somebody needs to do it. That just ain't me. Like, I'm not that brother to do it, man. But like, I want to talk to you about how you doing because there's just so much shit happening in the world.
Yeah, no, there's so much stuff going on, and I'm curious if you ever go through this, because to a degree, I'm thinking about how I'm a trained historian, and with history, there's like a certain luxury of just, ruminating over past events that are somewhat static, and now that I'm in this foreign policy space, how do you kind of handle it, where it's like, there's always something happening, there's kind of no reprieve, and I'm kind of, now that I'm, 2 years into this space, it's like, I miss history where it is what it is. It's, it's done.
I get it. Yes, I do have those feelings. I'll tell you things that really, I'm 40, I'll be 44 years old at the end of the month. And this will be my 24th year of voting. The first time I voted, I was 20 years old and it was the 2000 election. I was a sophomore in college. And I remember that was Al Gore versus George W. Bush. And I feel like when you talk about history, the saying, history repeats itself.
Yeah.
I feel like we're dealing with the same shit, but just with different characters. And as a journalist who's covered elections, like locally and nationally, one thing that I'm happy about with the foreign policy reporting that I do now full time, and I still do the intersection with the local elections. We're going to be talking about that during the show as it pertains to foreign policy. But sometimes I feel I'm going to always vote. I'm going to always participate in the electoral process. But I just feel like a lot of these elected officials pound sand up my ass, and it's like, can you give me something different, or like, can you not pound sand up my ass because I know the game? And the more I actually covered politics, the more jaded I've become.
Yeah.
Because the thing about you and me is that we are paid to take in knowledge.
Yes.
And regardless of what the politics are, Democrat or Republican, we both know when either party is full of shit.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just get really bugged and annoyed when the same game happens again, particularly with people who don't have the bandwidth to take in the information like the both of us.
Yeah.
And so, like, because the same shit that I see is spouted out now in 2024, it's the same hustle again and again. It's like the same hustle for, black people are surviving for our lives and da-da-da-da. It's like, I feel like we're runaway slaves in the political game, so to speak. You know what I'm saying?
We are, yeah.
It's like we're constantly running for our survival, and I'm just tired of this shit. Because I've been feeling it for 24 years, and the only difference between me and so many other black folk and you is that we continue to participate, and I can understand why people are discouraged. And that's where I'm at, dude. Like, I'm been in the game for a minute, feel like the same shit. I'm gonna vote, and I feel jaded. And if I feel jaded, how does everyone else feel? You feel me?
Oh yeah, for sure, yeah. I get it, and I think when we see these conversations about why we're seeing less black voter enthusiasm, these concerns about black folks might not come out. There was a recent article actually that came out. I think it was MSNBC that actually said it. That was talking about how like the number of blacks who are projected to come out in this election has reached like a new low. I mean, and I think a lot of it makes sense. Yeah, I think a lot of it is just disillusionment with the two-party system. And I know we're going to touch into it, but I do feel like there are ways to try to galvanize black voters. But I don't know, will the party, will either party listen to what I have to say? That remains to be seen. I don't know.
So that's what we're going to talk about, and that's some of the things that you deal directly with in your research. So the first part of the conversation I want to dig into is this study that you led, this survey that you led, and it surveyed how Black Americans think about what's happening in Gaza, which as far as I'm concerned, I'm going along with the South Africans. It's a straight up genocide. I'm with the South Africans on that. But what your survey really taps into is the one that was on April 25th. It's actually a response to a survey asking Black people their thoughts on Gaza and what's going on in Palestine and Israel that came from October, right?
Yes.
Right. And so these are new numbers. And so what we saw here is and this recent survey was done over a few weeks in March, I believe, end of February, March, roughly around that area of this year. And then y'all published the results in April the 25th. And so what we saw there's that definitely most Black Americans want an active U.S. role in ending the war in Gaza and protecting Palestinian lives. And so you say that we see that, according to the study, a majority of Black Americans, 68%, they would have liked to have seen the U.S. call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And so you said there's a polarity of 46%. I want you to explain polarity to us because a lot of us don't understand polling. And then you also said the findings found that 3 in 5 Black Americans believe that the U.S. military aid should be conditioned to ensure that Israel uses legitimate self-defense that's in accordance with international law. And then finally, a majority of Black Americans, 66%, said that their feelings towards Biden had not changed since Hamas's terrorist attacks in October 7th. But those under 35 years old and Black independents were more likely to feel worse about him since October 7th. So I just want you to unpack that before we get into the specifics.
No, for sure. It's a lot to unpack there. And I'm happy that you mentioned that point about these findings and how it might relate to the presidential election. Kind of feeds into what we were just talking about. But yes, so the first survey was ran So you had Hamas's October 7th attack, and then the first survey we conducted it at the end of October, essentially around the last week of October. And then this next survey, the aim was to try to do one, capture change over time. As you kind of alluded to, it was really helpful in kind of tracking how people are thinking. And that's one thing that we don't really have is data that tracks change over time for Black folks. Pew has a lot of Gallup, there's a lot of change over time data, but it doesn't disaggregate for Black Americans. So that's something that we're trying to do in the American Statecraft Program, is like, let's try to develop our own data set that tracks change over time in Black American sentiments. And I think it comes at an interesting time where you have, and I even talk about this in the second piece, Black faith leaders are a lot more vocal. The AME Church came out and stated that the AME, like the Bishop Council, said that the U.S. should stop all financial aid to Israel. And then before that, you had 1,000 Black pastors. This was a little bit previous, like in February of this year, 1,000 Black pastors that came out and said, the U.S. should push for some form of ceasefire. So I think that's really critical when we think about Black America, how Black America functions, and the role that the church has in the Black community. So that's really interesting. But getting into the data, yes, I think one thing that's really interesting, what we saw with in regard to the number of Black Americans who reported feeling connected to the Palestinian people. So in that first survey, only about 32% said they feel connected to the plight of the Palestinians. And interestingly enough, like 50% said they don't feel connected to either. And, and I think we've even chatted about this off the record about how interesting that is about Black Americans, 50% saying they don't feel connected. And I think there's a lot of different variables that play into that. But when it comes to tracking this, 6 months later, we now see it went up from 32% to 48% of Black Americans saying they feel connected to the Palestinian people. And I think the reason why we see that is the same reason why we see the number of those asking for a ceasefire going up. Well, one, historically, we've seen it ebb and flow, where you have Black Americans paying attention to the other oppressed people, paying attention to the situation in Israel, between Israel and Palestine. But with this war, unfortunately, this kind of segues into our conversation about Ukraine, with the war taking up the airwaves, kind of to a certain degree sidelighting other conflicts. We could talk about Haiti, talk about the war in Ukraine, and this is gaining a lot of traction on the airwaves. And I think that plays a critical role why we're seeing Black Americans maybe to a degree seeing, oh wow, there's oppression going on over there. There's something that's happening to these people that might be eerily similar to what is still happening to Black people in America or other parts of the diaspora. And I also think, because even in the survey, we also asked a question about, did the 1,000 Black pastors that asked for a ceasefire influence your desire to want to see a ceasefire? And to be clear, we didn't ask them. The survey didn't really differentiate if they already knew about the 1,000 Black pastors call for a ceasefire. So we didn't find that out. But when we did ask that question, a third said yes, knowing about the 1,000 Black pastors pushing for a ceasefire. They said that it strongly influenced them to ask for or to desire to see the U.S. push for a ceasefire in the conflict. So I think, like, in this case, what's really interesting is the role of the Black church, the historical role of the Black church in liberation movements, in human rights movements. I think that's partially what we're seeing here. I know there's a lot of data points. I want to tackle another one. Oh, let's tackle the situation with President Biden. And see, for me, Terrell, that was striking as well, because personally, I actually was expecting, in both surveys, 65% of Black people said the way President Biden has handled the war in Gaza has not influenced their opinion towards President Biden. So when the first survey came out, I kind of expected that. So, okay, I can see that. But when 6 months passed, you had the 3 Black service members that were killed in Jordan. You have now, at the time, I think roughly 30,000 Palestinians who were killed. I was expecting that number to probably go down, more Black people to say that they feel worse about President Biden. But you didn't really see that. But it still remains to be seen, as you said, when it comes to younger populations and Black independence. And that's one of my arguments, that when we talk about Black folks voting, Black folks coming out, I think what we're really seeing is Black independence. So these people probably are not necessarily Republicans. They probably have historically gone to vote out for the Democratic Party, but just are not staunchly Democrat like some aspects of the Black community, maybe like older Black people. And I think you're seeing that with like younger Black voters, where they would like to see more progressive policies from the Democratic Party. And my main argument here, and I said this, excuse me, in the piece, but in a very close political race, which I'm projecting this to be, it's going to be very tight. Any slackening of support from Biden's most loyal, not even just Biden, but the Democratic Party's most loyal demographic can prove fatal, in my own assessment. So I think that's really important, where you have major concerns about losing the Arab American vote, losing the Muslim vote. I mean, the white vote, we saw the last day of the white vote was very much so split. That's not really a demographic that even white women, it's not really a demographic that President Biden can really rely on. But when it comes to this, to the Black voting base, okay, true. A majority have said that their opinion hasn't really changed. But losing that young and that independent vote, I believe, could really prove to be a tipping point in how this election plays out.
Definitely, man. I want to go back to that third of Black people who said that when they heard their church leadership or the 1,000 Black pastors, that's something that sticks out to me, because a third is a lot. Let's just start there, right? And then secondly, I know when at my church, I go to Concord Church of Christ here in Brooklyn, New York, and we talk about it in my church. And my pastor knows I go to Ukraine, and he cares about what I do and all those other things. But and we're going to talk about Ukraine later. But Palestine, I think the thing that strikes a chord with us is that there's a long history of solidarity movements built between Black civil rights era types of people, and as well as Palestinians. And so we all remember the conversations that the BLM activists have said about the Palestinians teaching them how to protect themselves against tear gas in Ferguson. Like, we all know that. So even if we don't have the in-depth details, we know from secondhand information those types of stories, because, by the way, the vast majority of people, regardless of race, are not on the street protesting. Like, that's not the majority of the country or the society. When people say, when our people, when they want to get self-righteous, I always like, where's out on the street protesting? Well, were you auntie? Like, were you one of the ones? Maybe your cousins and maybe your friends and them was out there. Your generation did, but come on, auntie. But my point, you know what I'm saying? But my point is that, it's a small group of people that protest, but within the community, we know who those people are. And that's my point. And that's how we hear these things. And so we hear something about Palestine, and in Detroit, which has the largest concentration of Arab Americans outside the Middle East within the United States. We are in those communities, right? And so we hear about it. But I want to ask you really specifically about how influential do you think the church is in really educating our communities about what's going on in Gaza, because those are cherished institutions in our communities.
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to that New York Times article, and what's interesting, in the article, they actually stated that it was not all the pastors, but there were a few pastors who were highlighted in that New York Times article that actually said that we took this pro-ceasefire stance because of our younger parishioners, that because of the young churchgoers who are actually agitating about, okay, ceasefire, what's happening here. I don't know if it's at the time they're using the term genocide, but at the time they're talking about, okay, what's happening here is definitely a human rights violation. That is what pushed, in fact, the religious leaders, the pastors, to then co-opt and then to take this stance and then to agitate for some type of, policy change. So I think it's interesting where in the church, going back to what you're saying, that what we're kind of seeing is, this relationship where it's not necessarily just, okay, I'm the pastor, this is my, thinking, this is my thought process, I'm going to impart it on my followers, and the followers go out, and then, co-opt my ideas. We're actually seeing kind of like a relationship where it's actually the younger churchgoers, as highlighted in that New York Times article, who are now essentially, to a degree, pushing their faith leaders to then take these stances that are in line with what you're saying, in line with this long history of the Black freedom struggle. I'll say is rewriting the clock. I think just in general with the Black church, we have James H. Cone, Black liberation theology.
He taught my pastor, by the way.
He taught your pastor?
Yeah, Gary V. Simpson. Yeah, he taught my pastor, and look at me saying my He taught James Cone. He's Black liberation theology, because that's what we practice at our church. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, that's huge. I'm just thinking about even just my own real quick side note. My own dissertation, the main subject of my dissertation, he was an AME pastor, and there's a whole book that's out by Dennis Dickerson about how so many AME pastors became Garveyites. Because Garvey was preaching for similar Black liberation, Pan-African, Black independence, self-governance, so on and so forth. So what I'm saying here is that there's a history of Black pastors being married to these different movements. I think we're seeing that today in this case of there's a resurgence, because this isn't new, like you were saying, a resurgence in a political consciousness that is really kind of falling out of lockstep with U.S. policy that doesn't really put any constrictions or restraints on Israel policy toward the Palestinians. And then I think that we're seeing this from the Black church as an extension of that. I'm not, to be quite honest, I'm not a regular churchgoer myself, so I don't really know what's happening inside a lot of these churches. But
I got you. Listen, you don't even got to follow up. Listen, trust me, I get it. But I'm just saying that my church, we definitely talk about Gaza and we talk about Palestine. It's because again, we do Black liberation theology. You brought up James Cone, and that's a major tenet of ours. And it's something that's very vital. But look, I want to get one last question in before we get to Ukraine. And there's another part of your survey, this April 25th one that stood out. And you talked about the South Africa case that was brought to the International Court of Justice. And so the survey, the question asked, if the International Court of Justice finds that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza, do you believe that the U.S. should impose sanctions on Israel? 51% said yes. 51% of Black people said yes. 15% said no. 34% said not sure. What about that?
Yes, and thank you for mentioning that not sure. I wanted to kind of touch on that earlier when you talked about these not sures that we see in my surveys. And in other surveys, I've even highlighted this about how when you survey Black populations on different topics, but in particular foreign policy, the not sures tend to be higher. But still, even in this question, even with 34% not sure, I find it striking that you still have 51% saying yes, like that the U.S. should impose sanctions. And we even see this with the anti-apartheid movement of the 80s, where there was a major push also being led by college students, Black college students, for the U.S. to divest from apartheid South Africa, to then place some type of sanctions on South Africa. So I think that's interesting that you see that. And that's kind of what really sparked this question, was thinking about how have African Americans or African American political leaders thought about the U.S.'s stance or policies toward these nations who are, in fact, not really in line with like these democratic principles that we preach to be in, to favor and to, hold dearly ourselves. So, I find that striking. I think that's very interesting. I wish, I had, more room to pull other racial groups, because that would have been really interesting to see what other racial groups are saying. But I think what this kind of even speaks to here is that, there is a belief that there is, some form of genocide happening in Israel, and that this also speaks towards what African Americans think the U.S. policy what direction it should take. That's also my thinking as well, was how can we, craft a policy that is in line with what the American people are thinking. So that was also a really interesting finding. But I think the 34% really speaks to it in many ways. Unfortunately, for a decent amount of African Americans, we're not thinking extensively, on these topics. And I think I don't think that's a reaction. I don't think that's a function of like some form of like limited intellectual capacity. I would say that's a function of, as you said earlier, bandwidth. It's a function of bandwidth. And bandwidth in the sense of limited economic, limited resources, just more pressing domestic matters.
Because you actually, Chris, I just want to interject in here, because you definitely had a separate article where you talk about Black people are not voting on foreign policy, but we're thinking about it, right? So you definitely talked about that. I want to kind of segue into Ukraine right now, because what the thing that I like about your surveys is that it leaves a lot of room for exploration, because what I'm finding with a lot of these I don't know is that it's engagement. And so whether we're talking about Palestine or whether we're talking about Ukraine or Taiwan, just historically, Black people are not centered in these conversations. And I think the more that we are, the more that we can form an opinion regardless of what it is. And so what I like about what you did with what's going on in Gaza was that you did a follow-up from that October survey, and that you gave us some new data in April. What's interesting about Ukraine is that we're not engaged on this subject for a wide range of reasons. And I know I can speak about this because I talked to Black people about Ukraine. One, there's not been any, type of solidarity or anything like that established between our communities. That's the first thing. And then secondly, let's just be very direct about, when you look at Ukraine, you think about white people, right? And
That's what my mind.
Okay, but yeah, I get it, right? Because when they come over here, they integrate into whiteness. Whereas if you're an Arab American, maybe you can, but generally no. They experience Islamophobia and all these things, and so they can never be really, really white. And then a lot of them just flat out don't look white. And so you also have to think there are a lot of Black folk that come from the continent of Africa who are also Muslim as well. And so I know we're talking about Palestine, but more particularly we're talking about what I really want to bring up is that we're not, I think Black folk, when you think about Ukraine and military, it's like, okay, the Ukrainians are more aligned with Europe, and then you think about European and you think about colonization, even though they may not use that word, they know, like, okay, I don't think about Ukrainians building anything with me. And then when the war broke out in Ukraine, I was there. When I talk to Black people, they talk about the racism that Africans face when they were leaving in Ukraine, and then when they were going into Europe. And that's work that I continue to work on long term to this day. And some of the reporting is going to start coming out in the middle of the summer. But that's when they think about Ukraine. But I also see a lot of complexity. I see a lot of people who have sympathy for Ukraine, right? I also see that, I hear it when I talk to people. But let's go more directly into your survey, where just at the baseline, when you talk about military support, and we're going to unpack this because at first you, in this survey, this recent survey that is fairly recent, that sometime last, I don't know, what year did this come out?
That was either late 2022 or early 2023.
Okay, got you. Okay, fine. So basically, you spent one of your figure 3, you say Black Americans display minimal support for sending troops to either Ukraine or Taiwan. So, but here are the numbers. It says 21% of Black folk, when you think about Ukraine, it said, they'll do it. 55% said no, and 24% said, I don't know. And a lot of this has to do with the fact of NATO and Ukraine wanting to join NATO, and this fear of this war expanding into a NATO country. And what you brought up was that, hey, Black people, our numbers are overrepresented in the military, and so I bring up these things. So just let's unpack that.
Yeah. No, I think you brought up some really interesting things, and this is what you're kind of touching on, is like this, the awkwardness and the weirdness of just racial classification. I mean, we use it to function, but as you're kind of highlighting, with the Ukrainians, it's a lot of it's just, it's very nebulous, and it's malleable. So in this case, my argument is that there's several reasons why we might see the high 55% for Black Americans for like this minimum or minimal enthusiasm for sending troops to Ukraine. The first thing that I bring up, well, one, we're already dealing with the history of African Americans fighting, dying in the U.S. wars, making up roughly 20% of the armed forces, 30% of the enlisted ranks. And then also too, unfortunately, we're on the heels of the long wars on terror. And, I argue that if potentially we didn't have, 9/11 and Iraq, Afghanistan, other, smaller conflicts in the Middle East, you might see a different reaction. But yeah, having those long wars on terror where black casualties were minimal. I just want to be very clear about that. The long wars on terror, it was nothing compared to black casualties in Vietnam. But still, there's this lingering sentiment after Vietnam that black people, even if the data says otherwise, the sentiment that black soldiers are going to bear the brunt of the material cost of waging war. So I use that logic to kind of to rationalize why we see this high 55%. But then even on top of that, the other thing, the part that I think is really important here is I think the racial aspect. Unfortunately, in the U.S. context, yes, Ukrainians are racialized as being white, as we would probably classify white Americans. So even though there was no short response, no focus group based off of this, but just using my own theory, I believe that, yeah, in this case, it's perceived that, yeah, these are white people. Like, we see the same logic with World War I, World War II. Black activists made the same argument. This is a European conflict. So I use that argument, and like you were saying, black folks aren't really engaged on this. I'm not saying that logic is correct, but I was.
No, you're correct for breaching it. You're correct because that's generally how we view it. But we both know that it's literally, pardon the pun, not black and white as it functions over there. We both know, but they don't know that.
Yeah, no, and it doesn't get translated that way. But I think the general sentiment is, oh, that's a European conflict. Is white folks. And what's interesting, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but I'll speak for myself. I remember myself knowing minimal, still don't know much about Ukraine, not as much as you do. And what's interesting is when the conflict broke out, the first thing that you were hearing on black media outlets, just black Twitter, so on and so forth, was, well, look how they're treating the African folks. So I think the knee-jerk reaction for black people, and understandably so, is when these things happen, where are the black people at? So I think I remember hearing about people asking, well, how are they treating the Africans? And even though those, and from what I've read, is that those incidents, they were rather minimal, but I think that's still kind of like embedded and calcify a lot of people's thinking and consciousness that, when the war first broke out, they weren't letting Africans leave. And I think that's why I think that's why your work is important, because I think that does need to be demystified, because I believe that that's pretty much what a lot of people are still functioning on, this thinking that, well, why would we help the Ukrainians? They were racist to the black folks that were there.
Let me break that down. No, thank you for bringing that up. So it's a couple things. One of the challenges is that people were focusing on the racism that happened in Ukraine. It happened throughout the journey. So you have to remember what it's like to be a refugee. Well, not remember, because neither of us has that experience. It's like, what is it like to be a refugee fleeing a conflict if you're black? So particularly in Europe. And so the racism started when Africans were even trying to get to the train stations, or something simple like having the price jacked up on you 10 times, because the mentality of the taxi driver is, I want to take my people, my Ukrainians, to safety, whatever. And so I've had plenty of people tell me that a taxi ride that should cost $100, taxi drivers jack it up to $600, $700, or they get on the trains, they're pushed off, call all types of racial slurs when the trains are stopping from one town to the next. Just getting on the train, people are just verbally attacking them, saying that, well, these seats should be preserved for saving Ukrainian lives. That stuff definitely happened. And the challenge is that because there are so few black people that focus on Eastern Europe in general, who would have the consciousness to do this type of work, they're not available. And so they're not out there doing the field work like you're doing with black people and what we think about foreign policy in a somewhat real-time basis. That's the first dynamic, and it makes it more difficult to collect the data like you do, like empirically. And so I think that the instances of racism are a lot more pronounced than we actually know, because this is also a difficult community to really to really connect with. And that's a whole nother thing. Just even as a journalist, it's just really hard to penetrate. And so the racism also happened when they were going into Poland and going into Germany and going into other places like the UK, or going into Slovakia. A lot of these Africans like to go to Portugal because they say that it's the most comfortable place for them if they're black. But just think about what it's like as a passport holder from a country from the continent of Africa that doesn't have the same respect as our American passports, right? Where, like we are part of the Schengen regime where we can just kind of go through easily. They don't even stamp your passports. And so that anxiety of going from one border to the next, not knowing how that border guard is going to fuck with you or not, is a part of it. And so it didn't just happen in Ukraine. And so you have all of these instances that happen across an entire continent. And that's a lot of data to collect. And, it's not just being Black that's required to gather this type of work. You have to have the mindset to care about your people enough to see what the hell is going on. And so that's the main issue. Now, another side to that is that when I say, care about what's going on, actually having the academicians and the folks that are trained to go out there and collect that we need more people like you that study Russian, that study Ukraine. I mean, we got Kimberly St. Julian Varnon and, who's a historian at Penn State. We need a lot more of them. Again, that's a whole nother story about how the academy is not supporting Black folk to do this type of work that we're talking about. But then I think another thing that plays a factor into that large number of people that say no is that I do think that there is a misunderstanding about how Ukrainians are being treated in this war. I mean, as far as I am concerned, as far as what the scholars are saying about Ukraine, they're experiencing a genocide too. I mean, that's something that we really have to really think about. So we got multiple ones that are happening. It's just that a case like South Africa hasn't been brought forth yet, but you have children that are being kidnapped against international law. And not only the kidnapping, you also have these filtration camps where they're culturally, these kids are being trained to basically say, okay, Ukraine doesn't exist. You're not Ukrainian, any of these things. Like it's really bad. And then you have these oppression of the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And so like this whole erasing of cultures is something that's very much a part of the Russian colonial project. But because they look white, you don't think that white people can endure this shit, but they can. And so I think that with us, I think that there's opportunities to have larger conversations about how race traffics, because whiteness, the way that we think about it right here in the States, doesn't function like that in Europe. Even though they can integrate and function in the whiteness here, doesn't necessarily mean that has a role in Europe. And I don't think a lot of us understand that difference. And then a lot of it is based on even the Ukrainians themselves. I'm having conversations with folks and they say that, in the grand scheme of things, man, as much as I love Ukraine, the way that our media talks about Ukraine is a problem. In the way when they compare it to Palestinians or even Africans. I mean, what's going on in Congo, Sudan.
Yeah.
So I think with our people, even though they may not be able to articulate the differences like we do, they feel a difference, and we have to honor that, and we have to tap into that with our research, with our knowledge, to give them these nuanced understandings, because they've never been given an opportunity to adequately learn objectively from the two of us, because the mainstream media industrial complex just says, fuck these Africans, fuck whoever, and they just deal with these white people because some journalists said, well, this is a civilized European country. This is not like the Middle East. And you know what I'm saying? It's shit like that. And so I think a lot of that animus stems from the very things that I brought up and what you brought up too.
Yeah, I want to say two things, and I don't think this is what's driving the main thing in the data. So I follow and track a significant amount of what you might have from Black progressive academics. Like, have you heard of Gerald Horne? He's a oh yeah. So I'm sorry. Hope you're not catching that in the background. Oh yeah, perfect. So I'm thinking about Gerald Horne and what Gerald Horne, he's written extensively about the war in Ukraine. Well, not extensively, but he wrote a few pieces when the war first broke out. And a couple of other Black progressive academics, they've cited the war in Ukraine as being part of or being slightly influenced by NATO expansion. U.S. imperialism. So I feel like somewhat, and this is not just to come at Gerald Horne, I love his work, but some of what we're seeing, maybe when it comes to the Black intelligentsia, the Black academic class, is this perception that, not saying that Ukrainians don't deserve, justice and to be defended, but this idea that what you're seeing happening in the Middle East and what you're seeing happening with Ukraine is like this extension of U.S. imperialism, that we wouldn't even have this in the first place if we didn't have the expansion of NATO, if we didn't have,
love to have. I would love like the three of us like to have a conversation. Like I would love to talk to Professor Horn about this because I think, yeah, I mean he is. But here's the thing: like he's not. Generally, he's correct, but specifically, he's not. And so what I mean by that is that, look, I'm not going to be a lapdog for NATO. So listen, I get, like, trust me, we don't have to get into it. We both understand it, but the way that NATO functions, like from country to country, is vastly different, and so, yeah, so the reason, but in this, the main thing, if Putin was fearful of NATO, he would have attacked a NATO country, right? But he didn't do that. He attacked a country that's not a part of NATO, and a country that NATO repeatedly rebuffed and for a long time did not want until they realized that the Ukrainians could actually fight, right? So it's a bit more nuanced than this is the big bad West trying to play in Russia's backyard. It's not. It's far more complex than I think a lot of people, Black academics and progressive academics, would be willing to acknowledge, because they understand Western imperialism. But I also find in this particular class of people, like there is some type of there is a particular kind of nostalgia for like the communist project in Russia and Cuba and that ignores the atrocities that took place in a lot of these countries, all for the sake of yes, right, all for the sake of being against the West. And it kind of and the way that I hear these conversations is if it's like Western imperialism is the only imperialism that exists, which I think is just morally bankrupt and morally inconsistent. But I would love to have a conversation with these people, because another thing too is that they don't have regional knowledge of Eastern European culture and politics, because I think it's a oversimplification of what these people endure and the complexity of them, or a country like Ukraine, leaning into Western structures like the European Union that comes with NATO, versus a country in Russia that's committing a genocide against you, right? And so if you don't acknowledge that dichotomy, then we can't really have an honest conversation.
No, that's a really interesting point. I mean, and I've been wrestling with that and thinking about that a lot. Really not saying this is Du Bois. I mean, he's not the only person who, kind of had these politics, but he's like one of the more prominent individuals.
And he was wrong too in many respects. Like, I'm sorry, I mean,
no, you're fine. Oh yeah, no, for sure. I mean, pro Tokyo sentiments, but then pretty much kind of even verbally when it came out that what Tokyo was doing in China, pretty much said, well, it has to be done to keep China from falling to the West. So kind of like in many ways, reconciling that was a genocide, we can argue, with this idea of, hey, well, as long as it's keeping China from going to the West, then it's okay. But I think that is interesting, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think that you kind of see within like Black consciousness looking for counterweights to the West or to the US or to the US hegemony, where you kind of like what you're describing, you might see a misunderstanding of what's actually happening in Ukraine because of this nostalgia of this nation, i.e. Russia/Soviet Union, which was a potential counterweight to, the US and US empire.
Because that's the whole thing, right? At the end of the day, all of these systems fail us. So what really bothers me about this train of thought from some of these folks is that they're willing to fight one type of colonizer while forgiving the atrocities of another, or kind of now. That's a too strong word. I don't want to say forgiving. I would say, in the case of Ukraine, they're going through a genocide. To me, it's morally inconsistent to acknowledge the genocide and to acknowledge it in Gaza, but not in Ukraine. And I think a lot of antipathy is stemming from the fact that maybe these people, I think something of it is pretty simple. These people are white. It's not my fight. And here's the thing. I get it. but it's not intellectually honest. It's not morally correct. And so I find that in most cases, these folks do not have the regional knowledge to adequately make the statements that they make. They just don't. I see a lot of people who are really good on Palestine, but they just don't know Eastern European politics, and they just put it in this blob of whiteness, and it's far more complex than that. And so we can go on and on about this. I want to finally end off with your article where you talk about the West, and it's in the World Politics Review. It's a really great article, and you can go through the paywall by just putting in your email address, and then you'll get access to the article. But the article is titled "The West Should Engage with Reparations for Slavery and Colonialism." And so it's a really insightful piece because you really did, like, the whole point of it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's like, it's basically, we can build better ties and build a better connection with the global South if we acknowledge our fuck ups, essentially, right? If we acknowledge how, for example, you talk about in the article, the third session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, was held in Switzerland recently. A group of non-governmental organizations proposed the creation of a commission to investigate French reparations for Haiti. And what you also found was that, for all people who don't know, Haiti colonized the nation, then they became independent. They became the first Black independent country in the Western Hemisphere because they pushed out the French, and the French have been making them suffer ever since. And so the estimate, but they also came with a debt, right? And so the Haitians they had to pay France payments up until 1987, and that was after
47.
I'm sorry, 1947. 1947, correct. And this began in 1825. And so basically, they paid it up to 1947, and basically the amount that they paid, what it was valued at, is $21 billion from the of the Haitian economy over that particular time, right? We're not even talking about inflation, et cetera. And so what you see here, you see all these reparation movements that's happening around the world, where these formerly colonized countries are saying to Europe, namely, that, hey, you really have to pay us for the turmoil that you took us through, because part of the reason why we're not really developed is because of you. And so I'll finally read one more thing, then turn it over to you. In this article, you said, the movement, it has been seeking reparations for slavery and colonialism. It's provoked contentious debate. And so it's gained, so reparations movement has gained support in the Caribbean and African nations, and even Black people in the United States are joining. And so you have something, let me see here. Okay, so the Dutch Prime Minister in 2021 acknowledged that the Netherlands benefited from the transatlantic slave trade, but made clear that they're not going to pay any reparations back. The British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, in 2023, he rejected the idea of even apologizing for Britain's role in the slave trade, let alone paying reparations. What's interesting is that, if I'm not mistaken, he does come from an Indian background.
Exactly.
Okay, which also colonized, in Britain colonized India, and then the French Supreme Court rejected an appeal for slavery for reparations from Martinique, and Paris has acknowledged Haiti's forced payments as a moral stain in its history, but the French government has no plans for financial compensation. I'll end with this. The Russians have taken advantage of this in many ways.
Yep.
On the continent. Yep. By saying, you know what, though, those fuckers, they fucked you over, but see, we never enslaved you, even though they tried. That's another story. I'm going to bring in someone else to talk about that. Yeah, like, to try to colonize. They tried to colonize them. Yeah, there's some Ukrainians that's doing work on this. Like, they tried to have a more colonial role there. It just didn't work. But basically, your whole point in this article, man, was just talking about the need for the West and the U.S. to have conversations with, to really engage on this subject in a meaningful way. And it's just geopolitically, for our advantage, it makes sense. I want you to really talk about that.
Oh, yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. And this definitely segues, or it builds on our previous conversation, talking about, these, at the time, the term was third world, then it was, global South. Now is, I think, emerging powers, developing nations. The name's always changing, but these nations, and primarily I'm really speaking about the Caribbean, Latin American, African, and I even want to bring in, I will argue Black America, we're a colonized people. I want to bring in Black Americans as well, even though, we don't have our own independent nation, but, we're definitely a part of this larger conversation of seeking some form of like reparative justice for the acts of slavery and colonialism. And in many cases, you see, going back to what we were talking about with, Du Bois, when you don't get this form of, justice or democracy, you look for a counterweight to your so-called oppressor. And I'm essentially making this argument that is what we kind of saw in Niger. We saw this slew of coups, Niger, Burkina Faso, so on, Mali. There's this perception that France is this, which it is, this historical colonial oppressor, and it still lingers today. Colonialism led to underdevelopment, dispossession, and essentially France has not atoned for it. And even that's the case with Haiti, that France, Haiti was at one point in time France's richest, it was this cash cow colony, and then after being the cash cow, then has to pay back pay back France for gaining its own freedom. And we see the situation that we see today. So so when it comes to Haiti, we don't really see any major movement of the Haitian country falling into the arms of China or Russia, but we do see that in the West African case. We see Niger canceling its security agreement with the U.S., and then the Wagner Group, appearing in Niger. So essentially, my main argument is that throughout, and we don't really see that in the Caribbean. We do see it with Cuba. Historically, Cuba goes towards Russia. We don't really see any other major cases. Well, there was the one case with Grenada. Grenada, went socialist, and the U.S. went and stomped that out really quickly. But I argue, well, not really in this piece, but just more generally, I argue that a lot of this is a reaction to the underdevelopment that results from slavery and colonialism. So I say that in this case, where there is concern about how can we engage with these nations? That's one of the main questions that we try to answer in the American Statecraft Program. Understanding that these nations have a choice. Now, this isn't the mid 20th century where if a nation goes towards our near peer adversaries, we're not going to do regime change. So how can we properly engage? And I pretty much put forth, so that we can avoid the mistakes of the past of military interventions. Just take seriously the call for reparations. And obviously that's a huge, lift, a huge ask. But this is something that's serious. And if you see in the piece, I even mentioned, well, when slavery was abolished, in the U.S., in D.C., and in the British Caribbean, Britain and Lincoln, repaid former slave owners. So so we have, Haiti's one case where Haiti had to get paid to have their diplomatic recognition earned. And we see in the British Caribbean, the number, I don't have the numerical number, but it's in the article, where the British government paid back British Caribbean slave owners for their lost property. Lincoln paid $300 to every slave owner he paid every slave owner $300 for every slave that was freed. So we see examples of some form of compensation for losing your human property. So my main argument here is that, it can be done. I don't know what it will look like is something different. But if you want to kind of develop some diplomatic cachet to properly engage these nations, if you want to, don't want to lose them to this fear of China and Russia, so on and so forth, one way of doing it is really having serious conversations about the injustices of slavery and colonialism, which really wasn't too far ago. We talk about colonialism. Most of these nations in Africa and the Caribbean didn't become free until the 60s, 70s, and 80s. My grandparents are older than a lot of these nations have been independent. Even when it comes to just slavery, many of us are not many generations removed from the act of slavery. So, and that's one of my arguments, that there's going to be detractors who are going to say, "Oh, that was so long ago," so on and so forth. No, and then I even talk about Cori Bush domestically. She even makes the case that reparations isn't just for slavery, for Jim Crow era segregation and discrimination, which also was not that long ago either. From it's only
I'm pretty sure that we both got people in our family that pay the poll tax.
Yeah, exactly.
And they still alive.
So like, let's be really honest about these things. So that's my whole argument. So in short, my argument is that seriously engaging with the calls for reparations, which is gaining great traction, which I'm happy about. this could be a way in which to develop some form of diplomatic cachet with these nations. And like for example, with Haiti, I'm sure with the instability we see in Haiti, there's a lot of other factors. But I'm sure if we saw the $21 billion put back into the Haitian economy, we might not have to worry about every 10 years trying to put together a multinational peacekeeping mission force.
And Kenya, shit. I mean, damn, like Kenya. So basically, what Chris is laughing at, for those who are not familiar with the rampant reports and well documented cases of police brutality that take place in Kenya, right? Like it was mind blowing when I heard Kenya. I said, "Sweet G," and they haven't been deployed yet. Just to be clear, they haven't been deployed yet, but that was one of the considerations of sending them there, because there's this long debate about who will be going in to Haiti, because there's even a larger conversation about, because of Western, because the West has always poked its beak in Haiti all the time, because the U.S. occupied Haiti for roughly 30 years. I think that's roughly the time span, like 1900 to 1932, something like that. I'm not quite sure, but we have a history of occupying Haiti as well, and so. And then it's the 1990s, with the Bill Clinton there. Like, it's a whole bunch of things going on. But basically, man, it's great to be able to talk about how our people should be engaged in this stuff, because it's not as distant as people think it is. And what your work has shown is that if you engage us, if you ask us, we have opinions. And if we don't know, you follow up with us a few months later, then we'll be able to give you these answers. And so, yeah, we may not be voting on this, and I totally get it, but we are thinking about it. And so your work respects Black thought on foreign policy, and we need more of you, and your work needs to be further supported, because we're just smarter and more aware when we have people like you doing this work of gauging what we think about the world.
No, thank you so much. I mean, this is so real. I just want to, go back to the Haiti piece. And you're right. The U.S. Occupies Haiti. So the U.S. does have a kind of a stake in this, in the Haitian instability. Occupies Haiti for, like you said, 30 years. And then Duvalier, he's clearly a dictator. And just because he has, these anti-communist sentiments, the U.S. is supporting him for a time while he's ruling with a reign of terror, which brings into the U.S. interests and this idea of supporting a liberal world order, which kind of brings that into frame and critiques that as well. But these are conversations that really need to be had. And thank you for this, because I would love to to keep doing these type of surveys, keep tracking the thought process that's happening. And like I was saying earlier, I do think that this information there's gaps in the minds of policymakers and in their portfolios. And this work, your work, my work, it definitely fills in those gaps, and helps them answer, how do we interact with Black folks? It doesn't just have to be about domestic issues. There is a concern, especially when it comes to the use of force abroad. There is a concern about the U.S.'s role in the world.